Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. Shaka Sally is off. My colleague Vincent Makori, the host of Africa 54, is filling in for Shaka Sally. Hello, Vincent.
Hey, hello, Paul.
How are you?
I'm fine. It's a delight to be here with you today.
Great to have you again. A warm welcome to you all. Our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday here at the Voice of America. Today we'll be talking about a whole bunch of issues affecting the continent, but maybe let's start in Cameroon. So Vincent, in Cameroon, once again, President Biya exceeded all expectations and he was announced the president with nearly 71.3% of the vote.
Yes.
Your thoughts?
Yes, 71% of the vote, and circumstances that the opposition says are questionable in the first place, and that they're claiming there was fraud, including ballot stuffing, intimidation, and blatant stealing of the elections there. In fact, they launched 18 petitions in court, but all those were dismissed, and therefore Mr. Biya becomes president for another 7 years. He's 85 years old, meaning he may be about 92 by the time he's done with this term. But the question that anybody would want to ask is, what chance did the opposition have anyway, given that this man has been in position for many years? He has entrenched himself in that country, and therefore he controls everything. He controls the process, he controls the electoral process, he's controlling the officials who run the systems that conduct the elections. And therefore, given the kind of hold he has on the country, and the fact that the opposition was not even given a chance even to hold open press conferences, the opposition could not easily have rallies around the country. What chance did the opposition have? Almost nil. So it was such an uphill task even to see them get what they got, the votes that made the difference between 71% and 100%. So
I'm just curious why you didn't go for 100% of the vote, because the outcome was already known right before even people started voting.
Yeah, but, you know, sometimes the smart ones try to make what looks like a facade of democracy. They want to make it look like, yeah, there was some competition out there, but I won. Because if you make it 100%, then it obviously looks like what it is. But now it's like to hoodwink people, make it look like we competed and I came out a victor.
You see, Vince, for me, what I have trouble with is the simple fact that these leaders somehow have managed to blindfold us, to take us for granted, to take people for granted, and they think that they can keep doing this and get away with it. At what extent should people maybe start calling out, should people rise up against these guys? Because you can't go in an election and expect to win.
Yeah. First, there are many reasons why you can't go to the election and expect to win, because this is an issue of not goodwill, but institutions. Countries like Cameroon or Uganda and others don't have the institutions that can guarantee a free and fair election. So unless and until those institutions change, there can never be change at the leadership short of a revolution, which means literally people uprising against the government. And therefore, there has to be something that is earth-shaking in the country in order to have a change. But unless and until there's a strong constitution, institutions that separate powers, including a Supreme Court, a High Court, and an Electoral Commission that is totally independent from the executive parliament system that in fact has some muscle and independence, you cannot expect the opposition to go up against a person like Paul Biya and win the election. Coming to the other issue that you mentioned about the mindset of people. Great dictators are very smart people. They are psychologists. They study the minds and realize that human beings are manipulatable. And that's why institutions are the only safeguard for the people. Institutions are put in place to protect citizens against the excesses of their leaders, because politicians know that you can manipulate the minds of people. Just the same way cult leaders know that you can play around with the minds of people until they think of you as God. You know stories of people like Jim Jones, who literally took people to their deaths by convincing them that whatever they're telling them is the best and it's coming from some divine source. So a person like Paul Biya and other dictators, what they have done over the years, they've played around with the minds of the people by creating the impression that they are the only ones who mean well for them.
They have the vision thing.
They have this vision. They have the good, they have the best interest of their people at heart, despite the fact that most of these people are starving. They grovel in poverty, and this person spends most of his time in Switzerland, having a good time with his wife and his family, and enjoys all this, you know, the wealth of the nation. Of course, they have oil. Place like Cameroon, a lot of oil. Because there's cocoa, there's minerals. Yeah. He can have a wonderful life and tell the people that, you know, whatever you have is still very good for you. It's a gift from me. I'm maintaining peace in this country, and therefore, just keep following me, worshiping me, voting for me, because I'm the best thing that ever happened to this particular country. It is a mind-controlling thing that is common across all countries that are
Vincent, a lot of analysts have talked about how, for example, Paul Biya came into power in 1982. Yeah. 1982. So he has been at the helm of his country for over 36 years. What more can he do? What has he not done in those 36 years?
At some point, the fact is that there's nothing the person is doing. In fact, he's in power for himself. He's in power because he has convinced himself that this is my personal property. And most of these leaders become like mercenaries. It's not about what they're doing for the people, it's about what they're taking for themselves. They have concluded that this is their personal property. The people have no necessarily a lot of importance to them, because otherwise, if you love your people, if you really care about your country, first and foremost, you will think about the future of the country beyond your term. You will think about the rest, the millions of other citizens who could possibly do the job as you kind of retire and enjoy the benefits of having been given the privilege of running your country. The fact that you can be in power at 85 and still want to continue running the country, first it means you have no respect, or you have no regard whatsoever for the citizens of your country, because you can imagine how many Cameroonians are smart enough and young enough and energetic enough with amazing ideas that could possibly rule and transform the country. But this is being disdainful to your country, where you just say, I really don't care about you, I care about myself. It's not about doing anything for the country, because there's nothing that any mortal human can keep doing for 30, 40 years that another person in that country wouldn't do even better, given that every one of us gets older, gets a bit, you know, you get fatigued from doing certain things over and over again. So it's not about
I was looking at some of the reports, for example, some of the observers, especially the African Union observers, sort of endorsed this election. They said the process was free, fair, and credible. Yeah. And to add on to that is sometimes I get disturbed by the simple fact that in West Africa, they've figured it out. Southern Africa, they've figured it out. In East and Central Africa, a miracle has to happen for them to figure out what needs to happen. These leaders keep changing constitutions. Paul Biya is a perfect example. He has changed the constitution so many times to the extent that it really doesn't matter. Yeah. Yes, we understand it's a document, a working document, but how many times can you change a constitution just to hold on to power?
Yes, and that's why the citizens of a country like Cameroon have to fight for the change of not only the constitution, but the building of institutions that will say there is a time limit to which even the best and well-intentioned person can run a country. There's a reason why there's a retirement age in every job. There's a reason why in every activity in life, there's a kind of a time when you have to say, it's time for somebody else. These leaders' insistence on changing the constitution ostensibly to extend their stay in power is a clear demonstration that it has nothing to do with the welfare of the country, but it has everything to do with the personal interest and the desire to live on as the only president that ever happened in that country, die in State House, die as president. Their dream is to age and die as a president of a country. If they cared about their country, in fact, they'll be the first ones to say, I have served this long, I'm now tired, I'm a bit older, I need somebody with a little bit more energy.
Somebody to take over.
Somebody take over.
Yeah.
When even parents, even men and women who have personal businesses, a time comes when they call on their sons and they say, son, you know what, I'm getting older, I'm kind of tired, I want to take a back seat, I want you now to take over the government, the family business. This happens in every situation, even when there is business.
And in my language, we have a saying that says that even the best dancer leaves the stage.
At a point, there's a point at which the best dancer, the best athlete, everybody, regardless of how good you are, there comes a time when you say it's enough. When you're 85 and you insist you're the only one who can continue running your country, which has a majority young people, that is selfishness.
Before we go to the separatist issue, let's talk about, let's take some two comments. Let's start with Michael Adatela. What is the solution to this almighty leadership in Africa? Should we start revolutions? That's his question. Let's take another question. Election observers are always wary of saying the truth. Could this perhaps be the truth in the context of Cameroon?
I wouldn't want to be the person saying I want to call on people to rise up in their countries, but this is the truth. A very painful truth is that unless there is a change, fundamental change, that will bring in a constitution that separates the power of the executive from that of the judiciary and the parliamentary system, you will never, ever have free and fair elections. As long as the president, the executive, can control the process, can control the judicial system, controls the electoral system, there's no way. So before people go out there to participate in an election, they have to fight for the fundamental changes. It is useless. It is in fact futile to participate in an election exercise when you have the man that you're going against controlling the process. It is like having the referee like running a race.
Whose hands are tied.
And your hands are tied, and you're running against the person who literally is free and is controlling the whistle and will decide when
to score.
When to score.
You know, Joseph Stalin, Joseph Stalin one time said that it doesn't matter how many people show up to vote. What matters is who counts the vote.
Exactly.
And in this particular context, it could not be true.
Yeah.
And let's go to another comment here. Amos Achisisi says he agrees with you. Vincent, you're right on point. Maybe let's talk about the issue of separatists in Cameroon. We've been having a series of violence, especially in the Anglophone or English-speaking Cameroon. These people are advocating for change. They want to form their own country called Ambazonia. Your thoughts on that?
Yes. I mean, you can really sympathize with this. And we've seen separatist movements in different parts of the world, including South Sudan, which became a nation. What is the issue with the Anglophone Cameroon? Is that over the years they've felt neglected by the government of Paul Biya. There's no development in their area. Schools are run down, and when they look at the jobs, who gets most of the jobs in the government and the civil service, the plum jobs? The people from the French-speaking region. The people of this region, that now some people are calling Ambazonia, initially were just asking for the government to address their issues. You know, requesting, saying, please, come over. We also need roads. We also need development in our area. And the government gave them a deaf ear. Now, when the protests began a few years ago, it is because they got to a level of desperation and needed to express themselves on the streets. But when they came out on the streets, what happened? The government, of course, clamped down on those protests. We know that civilians were shot, killed. The government denies this, but there's a time when the civilians said that the protests were actually, the protesters were confronted by even helicopter gunships where civilians were shot at. Now, as a consequence, this has made the people of the Anglophone Cameroon feel like perhaps the only way to get a fair deal is to separate themselves and have their own nation so they can determine their own future. So unless Cameroon, the French-speaking Cameroon, and President Paul Biya, who is from the French side, was to be willing to treat the people from the Anglophone areas as equal Cameroonians, I see a problem here. I don't think the people, the Anglophone speakers, are going to relent. And given that progressively now they're seeing the ruthlessness of the government, we are likely to see a serious conflict in that region.
How about people who argue that, for example, they shouldn't be talking about separating right now or seceding? They give an example of South Sudan. You see what has happened in South Sudan ever since they attained their own independence in 2010. That country that was quote-unquote the newest country on the planet has been rocked by a series of violence. It's people killing each other, leaders are fighting each other. Should that happen in Cameroon?
Of course.
Especially in light of the fact that a lot of countries are trying to unite,
Of course, what has happened in South Sudan is a big shame. Shame on them, and also a big disappointment to many across the continent. But you see, what do you tell the Anglophones in Cameroon if the government is not willing to listen to them? I mean, how many years have passed since they started asking the government to address their issues? So despite of what we've seen in South Sudan, first, you cannot conclude that it's going to be a repeat of the same. South Sudan is not the first country to ever separate itself from another country. We even have examples of countries like Somaliland, who are not officially countries, but they run better than the bigger Somalia.
You have another group in Nigeria, the Biafra, people who want to have their own state.
Well, I say this, I always say that the reason why people get to a point of asking for secession is when the central government refuses to recognize that those people have genuine demands, genuine needs, and they need to be addressed. As long as you ignore that, people will clamor for separation regardless of what the future may have for them. It could be that they turns out well, but if possible, it will be better if they stay together as a country. But that is dependent on what is the approach of the government of Paul Biya. Now, is Paul Biya willing to sit down and say, acknowledge first that they have neglected that region and be willing to correct things? If you're not willing to acknowledge, and if your only reaction is to arrest people, to kill people, to push back, people will never stop demanding for freedom, because nobody wants to feel like they're an outcast in their own countries. Even you, as a son of somebody, you wouldn't want to be in a house where you're treated differently and separately. You will say, you know what, I better leave this house, maybe find my own life, or find other parents who may adopt me and give me a better life. So
that's a perfect segue to our next segment. In case you just tuned in, you are watching Shaka Extra Time. Shaka Sali is off. My colleague Vincent Makori, the host of Africa 54, is filling in for Shaka Sali. And today we are talking about, among other things, the elections and the big win for Paul Biya. And let's cross over to Kenya, your favorite country. So many things are happening there. For the first time, not a whole lot is coming out of Kenya in terms of corruption and whatever, but as we're planning to come on air, there was a shooting in one of in Kisumu,
yes,
in one of the chambers, the local chambers of Congress there.
Yeah.
No death was reported, but it's connected to what has been going on, the fight against corruption.
Yeah.
Maybe bring us up to speed.
What's happening here, we have this people called members of the county assemblies across the country. Kenya formed under the devolved governmental system, the new constitution. They created these new counties, which are similar to the states, say of Nigeria, or the states of the United States. Now, what has happened is that we started observing the corruption now shifting from central government to the local county governments. And the MCAs, these are the representatives of the people at the local level, like county representatives. What they came to discover is that they have these loopholes to enable them to also really benefit themselves from the largesse of this of the local governments. So in their fight to get whatever they want, first they have come at loggerheads with speakers of these local assemblies. So sometimes
very powerful.
Very powerful. And sometimes the speakers come at loggerheads because they may refuse to approve, for example, release of funds to these representatives of the people, because sometimes some of these funds you cannot kind of account for them very clearly, you know, what they are meant for. We've seen a lot of corruption at that local level, whereby members of the local counties, local assemblies are actually being paid huge allowances for things they did not do. For example, they would be paid allowances for having attended seminars and workshops.
But that's not new in Kenya.
Which, of course, is not new. But because of that, there's a conflict now between the speakers who are trying to control and sometimes speakers who are being accused of corruption themselves. So we're seeing
How about those people who say it's our time to eat?
That is what the devolved government has become now. What people are saying in Kenya is that we used to have corruption at the central government. Now corruption has been devolved. In other words, it has been decentralized and everybody wants to go and work for the local county government. There's a lot of money in any of these counties, and there are so many loopholes to get, you know, money that you didn't work for.
Are we in the wrong careers, Vincent?
Man, I don't know what happened to us.
So let's talk about one of your good friends, Raila Odinga. Raila Odinga is becoming a statesman. Now he's being recognized by the African Union. He was, as of recent, appointed one of, I think, a representative for infrastructure development across
the continent.
Yeah. The significance of that?
Significance of that is that, first, Raila Odinga's legacy is kind of being slowly but very steadily weaved at the moment. Raila Odinga is a person who has, in the eyes of some Kenyans, won the election in Kenya to become president and been denied. And what followed is that there was so much tension in the country, demonstrations. But for the sake of peace, Raila Odinga and the current president reached out to each other through what they call now famously a handshake. And the goodwill between them cooled down the tensions. And there has been now clear cooperation between the two, which has led the country to a different path. Now, what people are saying in this is that this is one way in which the president is kind of showing that not only can he work with Raila Odinga, but he can find something for Raila Odinga to do. People are seeing the hand of Uhuru Kenyatta in the appointment of Raila Odinga to this continental body. It's not the first time Raila Odinga is being recognized by the AU. When he was prime minister, he was a special envoy to conflicts like those of Ivory Coast. Therefore, he's a well-respected man. He's a statesman in Zimbabwe and elsewhere. So one of the other things I think that was being discussed way before by some people is that Raila Odinga deserves to be doing something because he's a smart guy. He's a person who seems to bring a lot of wisdom to any kind of thing that he's doing. So the significance of this is that whether Raila becomes Kenya's president or not, he will go down in history as a person who was extremely transformational, both locally and now as the special envoy for infrastructural development across the continent. He might end up actually becoming the most instrumental person in the direction in which the continent takes in infrastructural development in Africa, especially in this age where we see China coming big on the ground. And remember, Raila Odinga is an engineer, so this is very appropriate and very fitting for a person of his skills and maturity in politics, wisdom, and a kind of continental respect. Yeah,
speaking about the rise of China, let's maybe dig that, let's get into the China issue. There is a lot of infrastructure developments taking place on the continent, funded and built or constructed by the Chinese. But on the other hand, there are other power players who are getting into the market. You have Turkey, for example. You have Russia, United States. some European countries. What's at stake?
Yes, at the moment, Africa is the most beautiful girl.
I like that analogy.
Everybody is courting this girl. What we are seeing is that all these countries are recognizing that Africa has this potential because of the resources it has. Whatever any of these countries is doing, remember Turkey, actually the president of Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan, has made in the last few months 30 trips to Africa, including recent ones where he met to Mauritania, he met to Mali, he went to Somalia and all that. And he's committed to engage these countries both economically and militarily. We've seen Russia going in big time, including Central Africa, and they're signing military cooperation deals. But at the core of all this is the economics. Africa is a country awash with mineral resources. It's a wealthy continent, something that some people may not realize. And because of having kind of slackened, especially the Western nations after some time, China went in big time, started constructing this infrastructure across the continent. In a way, it awakened. China has awakened Turkey and the United States and the European nations to the reality that this continent has always had this potential. In fact, these countries that are now coming in today, lately, had the opportunities to do this long ago. They kind of slept on the wheels. China's coming and in fact covering the entire continent with its infrastructural projects has made Turkey, Russia, and now of course the United States has been there, but in a way rethink how to engage with the continent and benefit from the potential that exists there, both the mineral resources and the manpower and a potential market. Some people forget that Africa is a market of 1.3 billion people. It's a huge market.
Yeah, I like the fact that for the first time, actually, Africans are being engaged as partners. When you remember, like back in 1844, during the Berlin Conference, no African was involved during the scramble and partition of Africa.
They subdivided the continent among themselves, but now Africa has the kind of bargaining chip. And Africa needs to just recognize the potential it has and the importance it has to the rest of the world in order to get a better deal.
We are almost running out of time. What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
On Straight Talk Africa tomorrow, we talk about investigative journalism. This is the most important form of journalism, and we'll be looking at two recent reports, one on South Sudan corruption, and the other one is on Liberia, the sexual exploitation of little girls who are being helped by special schools through an NGO formed by an American lady. So we'll be looking at why it's important to engage in investigative journalism, but the challenges, the risks, and the cost of investigative journalism.
Okay, very, very briefly, can you talk about what young people should be advocating for in Africa? Very briefly.
The young people should be advocating for more space to create, to be creative, and also demand that there should be not only political space, but institutional change. Because when you have a flourishing democracy and freedom, then you can actually create and literally develop the continent. If you have impediments through autocratic regimes, there's no hope.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for being a great guest, Vincent. It's been a pleasure hosting you, and I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time, probably next week. Until then, so long from Washington. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.
security space.